Hey, welcome back, podcast friends. And this is going to be another episode that's going to be talking more about diabetes. And this one, what I want to explain to you is, I'll give it to you at the very beginning. I'll just go through the basics, kind of get people up to speed. And this is all stuff that I've talked about in my past podcast. But I want to explain to you kind of the difference between type 2 and type 1 diabetes, and then go into what's called diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a very serious condition that a type 1 diabetic can get into. And type 1, remember, that's somebody who doesn't produce any insulin at all. Their pancreas just doesn't work. So, first, what is insulin? Insulin is an energy storage hormone. That's what it does. And this is released from your pancreas. Insulin is a hormone that's released from your pancreas in response to a meal, anything that you eat. But different things that you eat have different responses to the insulin, or has a different insulin response. So, like when you eat a meal that has a lot of fat in it, fat doesn't increase your insulin levels at all. And that's very, very important. You can eat a lot of fat and don't have to worry about your insulin levels going up. And remember, that's the number one cause of all the diabetes that we have, all the different organ failures and everything that we have. Right now, most of our diseases are caused by having high insulin levels and also having high inflammation in our bodies. So high insulin levels are very, very, very important. And they just like they tell you that type 2 diabetes is a problem of having too high blood glucose. But remember, too high blood glucose and type 2 diabetes is a symptom of insulin resistance. Okay. So insulin resistance is actually the underlying cause. High blood glucose is that's just an adverse effect or a side effect. So anyway, insulin is released from the pancreas in response to food. Fat doesn't cause any insulin release at all. Your insulin levels stay low. When you eat protein, your insulin levels go up just a tiny, tiny bit. But when you eat carbohydrates, remember, because all these macronutrients that you eat get broken down in your digestive tract, in your intestines, to this basic building block. So fat gets broken down to fatty acids, protein gets broken down to amino acids, and fat gets broken down, and carbohydrates get broken down to glucose. Okay, so really, we won't be talking about fat and protein through the rest of this talk, because they don't affect your insulin levels. Carbohydrates are the big one, because all carbohydrates get broken down the basic building block of glucose, and glucose is what really makes your insulin levels go high. But now there's different types of carbohydrates that can make your insulin level go high. First, when you put a carbohydrate in your mouth already starts a digestion. You have an enzyme called amylase in your saliva that breaks carbohydrates down in the mouth to glucose already. So once you start putting glucose in your mouth and it starts getting broken down, or carbohydrates gets broken down to glucose, your pancreas already starts producing insulin. So it doesn't have to wait till the glucose gets into the blood. It already knows it just by sensing it in your mouth. And this is called the cephalic phase of insulin release. So as soon as you put glucose in your mouth, your insulin levels start going up. Then you swallow that glucose, and that's when it actually gets put into your blood. And this is when your insulin levels really go up. So different types of things happen. So when you have anytime you put something sweet in your mouth, that also will make your insulin levels go up. So even if you have a diet soda that doesn't have any sugar, it still has that sweet taste. You could put an artificial sweetener in your mouth and spit it out and test your insulin levels, and your insulin levels will still rise. So as far as the types of carbohydrates that make your insulin levels go up, there are God-made carbohydrates and there are man-made carbohydrates. The God-made carbohydrates are all what you would think, your fruits and your vegetables. And these have different effects on your insulin levels. So when you eat green leafy vegetables, that doesn't have a whole lot of glucose in it. Okay. Just think of it. They're not real firm. So these green leafy vegetables will make your glucose go up a little bit, but not a whole lot. A lot more than protein and fat would, though. Then you have the types of plants. And remember, a carbohydrate is anything that's plant-based. So you either have animal-based foods or plant-based foods. All carbohydrates are plant-based foods. And then there's other plant-based foods, which are tubers. These are the ones that are the roots of the plant. These are grown underneath the ground. And these are the vegetables that have a lot of starch. And a starch is just an extremely complex glucose molecule. It has a bunch of glucose molecules crammed together into a lot of glucose molecules. So whenever time you eat starch, you're going to be putting a lot of glucose in your body. So when I talk about the tubers, we're talking about things like potatoes, carrots, parsnips, turnips, beetroot, sweet potato, radishes, taro. All these are tubers. All these are the roots that come out of the ground. And so these have a lot of starch, a whole bunch of glucose. So those you really want to avoid. If you're having trouble monitoring or maintaining your blood glucose, stay away from those big starchy vegetables like that. And then fruit, fruit also is sweet. Fruit also can make your glucose levels go high. So just kind of decrease. And again, some fruits are better than others, but that's not what we're going to be talking about now. Then you look at the man-made carbohydrates, everything in the box, bottle, bag, and can that's in the middle of the grocery store aisles. Those are chemically made to make sure that you don't stay full. They want you hungry all the time. You get addicted, so they want you eating it all the time. It's made out of no animal products. It's all carbohydrates, ultra processed carbohydrates, vegetable and seed oils, and sugar and high fructose corn syrup. That's what all man-made products are, all man-made glucose. So when you eat this is where your insulin levels really go high. And since it doesn't keep you feeling full and you eat this stuff all through the day, then this is when you maintain very, very high insulin levels. And that's how you can end up with insulin resistance. And again, I'm just breezing through this really fast because this is just summary of some of the other podcasts we've had. So anyway, insulin is released when you eat basically when you eat carbohydrates. When you eat man-made carbohydrates, they're going to go really high and stay high all the time. When you eat God-made carbohydrates, they'll still go up, but you don't tend to eat as much when you eat those. So how's this work? When you eat any carbohydrate and you have glucose, the glucose goes in your stomach. It's only there for a very short while because carbohydrates are easy to break down, goes in the intestines, and then gets shunted straight over to the liver. Now, once all this glucose is in the liver, now your liver triages what it's going to do with the glucose. So there's three main things that it's going to do. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to look and see what kind of activity you're doing at the time, right after you eat. So some people may eat and go out and play ball, or eat and go ride a bike, or eat and go walk. So whatever activity you do right after you eat, the glucose that you put in your blood, a lot of that may go towards that. But that doesn't take as much energy to walk and do all that as you might think it will. So that doesn't come close to taking care of the glucose. However, a lot of people, they eat and then they just sit down. They go sit back down at their desk. They sit down on the couch. They lay down, whatever. These are the people who their glucose isn't going to be used for activity at all. Now, the second thing that happens after it takes care of the activity is, remember, you have little glucose stores all through your body called glycogen. Well, all through your skeletal muscle, you have 1% of each of your skeletal muscles has a glycogen store, and that's glucose. When you take glucose and you make like a little glucose brick in your blood or in your liver, it takes these little glucose, puts together like a glucose brick, and that's called glycogen, and that's the storage form of glucose. But you don't have very much storage form. You only have 1% of every skeletal muscle, and that glycogen is only good for that skeletal muscle. And then you only have about 10% of your liver, and that's all you have. You don't have very much at all. So, and if you eat glucose all the time, chances are your glucose stores are not going to be full. But so you eat the glucose, goes to the liver. The liver says, okay, first I'm going to use this glucose for whatever activity I'm having at the time. Then it's going to take some glucose and refill up any glycogen stores that may have been burnt, you've already gone through, and so they're getting depleted. But all the rest of the glucose that's in there, your body, your liver will turn that into triglycerides, turn it into a fat in the form of triglycerides, and store that in your fat cells. And this is very, very important, because this is why type 2 diabetics are obese, because they become insulin resistant, that all they can do is store fat in their fat cells. And so they become bigger and bigger and bigger. So the key to any type 2 diabetic is you want to keep your carbohydrate intake low. You want to keep your blood glucose low naturally. The way you keep your blood glucose low is you quit eating carbohydrates that get turned into glucose. And whether you're type 1 or type 2 diabetic, either one, you can do the same thing. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So the difference between these, and I talked all about this, because what happens is when your insulin levels are high, all you can do is store fat for your energy source. When your insulin levels are high, you cannot burn your own fat. However, when your insulin levels go down, all you can do is burn your own fat for your energy source. You can't store it. And that is the key to diabetes. Well, type 2 diabetes, especially if you keep your insulin levels down, then you're going to be forced to eat your own body fat for your energy source. And that's a great thing. That's the best way. That's the way God made us, is to use our own fat. And we use what it does, our body breaks those down to what's called ketones. And I'm going to be talking about that. But so that's the key to type 2 diabetes. If you quit eating carbohydrates, or definitely no man-made carbohydrates, and stay away from tubers. If you can stay away from carbohydrates, then you're going to quit putting glucose in your blood. If you quit putting glucose in the blood, you're going to quit having high insulin levels. If you quit having high insulin levels, then you're not going to have to worry about insulin resistance, and you're not going to have to worry about storing more fat. All you're going to be doing is burning it. So the difference is, with type 2 diabetes, when these fat cells get full, they're going to start filling up. So as you keep eating glucose over and over and over, you continuously put more and more fat into your body. All of a sudden, your fat stores are going to be becoming full. And once those get full, now your body's going to start storing that fat around your organs, and you're going to have fatty organs. You're going to have fatty liver, fatty pancreas. You're going to have fat around your heart. You're going to have fat going everywhere, because it's trying to store all this glucose that people continuously eat all through the day as carbohydrates. So the key is, you want to keep both your glucose levels low and your insulin levels low. That's the key for type 2 diabetes. So the only way you can keep, if you look at medications for diabetes, the way they work is they only look at your blood glucose, and the way they lower your blood glucose, they actually stimulate your pancreas to produce more insulin. So really, when you take type 2 diabetics, it's making diabetes worse, because you're stimulating the insulin to keep the glucose levels down. And again, the key is to keep both glucose and insulin levels down, which means quit eating glucose. So when you have a patient who has continuously high insulin levels and high glucose levels, what you end up having is this type 2 diabetes that we see. Now, when you look at type 1 diabetes, remember, type 1 diabetes, these people don't produce any insulin whatsoever. So where type 2 is high glucose and high insulin, with type 1 diabetes, all they can have is high glucose, because the insulin you don't have the insulin on board, so you can't triage this around. So when you have a type 1 diabetic, before they ever discovered insulin, these are the patients that would come into the doctor, and they were extremely emaciated. There was no fat on their bones, because again, when your insulin levels are high, you store fat. When your insulin levels are low, you burn fat. So obviously, in type 1 diabetics, their pancreas doesn't produce any insulin whatsoever. So their insulin levels are lower than low. They're non-existent. So all they can do is burn their own fat. So back before 1921, before insulin was discovered, that's how patients with type 1 diabetes would show up. And most patients back then, there weren't very many type 2 diabetics at all back then. It's mostly type 1 diabetics. These patients would show up, they'd have extremely high blood glucoses. We're talking about glucoses like 400 to over 1,000, but their insulin levels were 0. So since their insulin levels are low, even though they had all this glucose in their blood, they couldn't do anything with it. So all they could do is burn their own fat. So depending on how much fat they had on board when they end up getting type 1 diabetes, that's going to determine how long they can go before they become so skinny, so emaciated, so weak that they were going to the doctor. And this is when the discovery of insulin came in. And this was huge when they discovered insulin, because now they found when these type 1 diabetics came in, they were extremely emaciated because they had no insulin. So all they were doing is burning their own fat. They were so emaciated that they were dying. Once we discovered insulin in 1921, and this was discovered in Toronto, Canada by Sir Frederick Banting, Charles Best, and J.J.R. McLeod. These guys discovered insulin, and then they started giving this insulin to these type 1 diabetics. And all of a sudden, they start fattening up again. So they give them some carbohydrates, they give them the insulin, and these type 1 diabetics, they started, and I don't mean getting fat, I mean just fattening up. They were starting to get energy reserves in their fat cells again. And this totally changed their life, because now with insulin, they could basically live the same kind of life as a normal person. So instead of dying early like they used to, now they can live a normal life as long as they give themselves the insulin. However, what happens is really crazy, because now that we do have insulin, what we've been doing is, since we knew that type 1 diabetics they did a lot better if you gave them carbohydrates and gave them insulin. But that was because they didn't have any insulin and they didn't have any fat stores. But we've continued with this logic when we're talking about type 2 diabetics. So now we never used to give type 2 diabetics, we never used to give them insulin. That's why type 1 diabetes used to be called insulin dependent diabetes because you had to give yourself insulin. It was also called juvenile diabetes, juvenile onset diabetes, because most people who lose the use of their pancreas, a lot of times that happens in childhood and they don't know why. They think it's an autoimmune disease, maybe from a virus. We're still not sure what caused the pancreas to quit working, but it usually works stopped when they were in their childhood, and then they had type 1 diabetes the rest of the time. To where if you look at type 2 diabetes is called non-insulin dependent diabetes because they've always known type 2 diabetes is a problem of eating. It's a problem of eating too much glucose, eating too many carbohydrates. We've always known this. So you don't give insulin to somebody like that. You just give them information on how to quit eating carbohydrates and stick more to animal meat and animal fat. And just a little bit of carb, God-made carbs like green leafy vegetables. It was also called type 2 diabetes was also called adult onset because you never saw type 2 diabetes in young kids because it took a while for this, eating poorly all this time for it to actually build up to where you have type 2 diabetes. However, that's not the case anymore because now we're telling people even with type 2 diabetes that they can give themselves insulin, or we give them medication that makes your pancreas produce insulin. So now we don't call it adult onset or juvenile onset diabetes or insulin dependent, non-insulin dependent. Now we just call it type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Okay. And this is where we need to get back to treating type 2 diabetes the way we used to. Because what happens is now when we have a type 1 diabetic and we teach them, they give themselves carbs and then give themselves insulin, and we don't give them information on the types of nutrition they should eating, what we're finding are some type 1 diabetics who don't produce any insulin are eating so many carbohydrates that they're having to give themselves so much insulin that when they eat all these carbohydrates and take insulin, it's getting stored and turned into fat and stored in the fat cells. And we're doing that so much that now we're even giving our type 1 diabetics insulin resistant because of the insulin that they give themselves because of the food, because they've never been explained to what a proper nutrition is. And so now we have a new condition called double diabetes. That's when you have both type 1 diabetes because your pancreas doesn't produce any insulin, and type 2 diabetes because you're eating so many carbohydrates, giving yourself so much insulin, you actually make yourself insulin resistant. And this is a brand new disease. We've never seen this before, and now we're starting to see it more and more. And it's all because these diabetics are not getting the proper information for nutrition, which is if you're having problem monitoring glucose, quit putting glucose in your mouth. And the way you put glucose in your mouth is by carbohydrates, because all carbohydrates get broken to glucose. All carbohydrates are plant-based foods. And I won't go into that because I've talked about that in all my other podcasts. But what happens besides this, another thing that happens with type 1 diabetics is insulin is so expensive that there are some type 1 diabetics that cannot afford their insulin. And so they quit giving themselves insulin. When this happens, what happens is now they keep eating the same way, but they're not giving themselves any insulin. And so these people can have very, very, very high blood glucose levels. Okay. And this can be very concerning. That's when we're going to get into DKA. But one other thing real quick before I do this, is there another thing that we see as far as issues with type 1 diabetes is some people, and it does seem to be mostly it's teenage girls who are type 1 diabetic. They have realized that if they don't give themselves insulin, they don't get fat. So they may try to go and skip giving themselves insulin so they can become thinner and thinner. And this is the horrible thing to do. And the reason why is because of a condition called ketoacidosis. Okay, so you should never be holding insulin from yourself. What ketoacidosis is when you cannot use glucose for your energy source. So you don't have any insulin on board, so you can't use insulin for your energy source. Your body's going to be forced to use fat for its energy source. And this is perfectly fine. This is the way we were made. God made us this way. So we use the fat out of our fat cells for our energy source. However, there's a big difference between having insulin present and using your fat and not having insulin present and using your fat. So what happens is these when you start using your fat for energy source, what your body does, it takes the fat out of your fat cells, it takes it to the liver in the form of triglycerides, it breaks triglycerides into free fatty acids. And again, I'm just going through this because I've talked about this before. The fatty acids get turned in what's called ketone bodies. Okay. And that's what our body can use for energy. And that's a wonderful thing to use for energy, way better than glucose. But it turns it into ketone bodies. And the three main ones that it turns it into are beta hydroxybutyrate, BHB, and that's about 80% of our ketone bodies are beta hydroxybutyrate. Then there's also acetoacetate and acetone. And acetone, when it breaks these up, this gives your breath a real sweet smell. So what happens in type 1 diabetics, they can't use glucose. They're not getting themselves insulin. So the fat is just coming out of their fat cells, going to the liver and getting turned into these ketone bodies. And so when we have a type 1 diabetic come in that has a very high glucose, you can smell their breath and they have a real sweet breath smell. And that's why acetone has a real sweet smell. And that's when we know that we may be dealing with a diabetic ketoacidosis. So what is diabetic ketoacidosis? Diabetic ketoacidosis is when you can't burn any glucose, you're burning all your fat, and that's all you're doing is fat. You have no insulin levels at all. Your insulin is zero because you're not giving yourself insulin. And so your ketones start going up and up. And so now there's a difference because with diabetic ketoacidosis, like I said, your ketones are high, but so is your glucose. Your glucose is going to be around 400 over 1,000. But in normal people, when you look at insulin, ketogenic diet, and DKA, because a lot of people, when you start talking about ketogenic diet, if you talk to a physician about that and they don't understand this, immediately they start thinking ketoacidosis. So they're going to start telling you, oh, no, ketogenic diet is horrible because you had these increased ketones. And that's what we see in ketoacidosis. Two totally different things. Okay. Your ketones aren't going to go anywhere near as high when you have some insulin on board to help take care of all this. So the difference is when you look at the insulin, if we're just looking at being in ketosis, like with the ketogenic diet, looking at ketosis versus ketoacidosis, when you're in ketosis, if you look at your insulin levels with it, people who eat the normal standard American diet, which is all this ultra processed, horrible, nutrient void, toxic stuff that you get off the shelves at the grocery store. When you eat that kind of stuff, you keep your insulins around 6 to 23. That's where they'd like to keep your insulin levels, 6 to 23. And this is insulin. This isn't glucose. Your insulin levels, they say that they want an insulin level around 6 to 23 units per liter or micro units per liter. With a ketogenic diet, you're going to have ketones or you're going to have insulin that you really want to keep your insulin levels below 10. That's where you want. And ketogenic diet, you really like to keep your insulin levels below 3 if you can. And obviously with DKA, you have your insulin levels are 0. Okay. So we're going to go through what the normal is, what you see in ketogenic diet, and what you see in DKA. And I'm not promoting the ketogenic diet. I'm not saying that. But I like the ketogenic diet. I think a lot of people are getting very healthy on it, but that's not what I'm talking about. So as far as the ketones, when you look at the ketones, if you're talking about the beta hydroxybutyrate, when you're looking at somebody who's on the standard American diet, which is nothing but glucose, basically, they're going to have very, very low ketone levels. It's only like 0.1, okay, millimoles per liter, 0.1. When you're talking about the ketogenic diet, where you eat a lot of protein and you eat a lot of fat, but you don't eat very many carbohydrates, then your ketone level may get around 0.5 to 5 micromole or millimoles per liter. But when you're talking about DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, your ketone levels are like way over 25 millimoles per liter. Not even you can't even do that when your body's producing insulin. Okay, so for ketogenic diet, the ketones are only like 0.5 to 5 millimoles per liter. For DKA, it's greater than 25. So you have a lot more ketones because you don't have any insulin on board. Now the big difference also is, with the standard American diet, what we want you to keep your blood glucose is around 80 to 120 milligrams per deciliter. With a ketogenic diet, you're going to keep a lot lower glucoses. So your glucoses will be around 65 to 80 milligrams per deciliter. But with DKA, remember, with DKA, you're keeping this glucose, but your body can't do anything with it. So it just stays in the bloodstream. So that's why with DKA, you have patients coming in with their blood glucose is well over 300, 400, 1,000. And I know I've already said that before, but I want you to understand DKA, when you don't have any insulin on board and you're not giving yourself insulin, your blood glucoses can go very, very high. And this is what brings us into all the trouble with diabetic ketoacidosis. Because what happens in diabetic ketoacidosis is your glucose levels are so high. And what happens is it pulls wherever your glucose is high, it pulls water into it. So if you have a high blood glucose in your blood vessels, you're going to be pulling water in from all your interstitial fluid all around the blood vessels, pull that into the blood vessels. And this is going to make your blood vessels, one will make your blood pressure go high, but that's not what we're worried about. What happens is in the brain, your brain does not want your body taking fluid out of it. Okay. So as you slowly, and this is with diabetic, with type 1 diabetics, as they slowly increase their blood glucoses because they're not giving themselves insulin for whatever reason, their glucoses go higher and higher. As it goes higher and higher, your brain feels that it's starting to pull water out of it, and your brain doesn't want it to pull water out of it. So what happens is your brain starts making what's called idiogenic osmoles. It reconfigures its proteins, and I don't think it's known why, and that's why it's called idiogenic. That means we don't know. It starts reconfiguring proteins to make them where it can counteract the fluid pull. It's called the osmotic pressure. It's the blood glucose. The glucose in the blood is trying to pull water out of the brain. The brain makes these idiogenic osmoles to keep the blood from pulling it out. So as your glucose slowly goes higher and higher and higher, your brain slowly makes more and more idiogenic osmoles to balance that out. So the fluid levels stay the same. You're not going to get this fluid shift. And this is perfectly normal. Then as your glucose starts coming down, then these idiogenic osmoles start switching back around and start coming back down as well. However, what's bad with diabetic ketoacidosis is if we bring the glucose down too fast. And this is where the problem is. Because if somebody comes into, say, the ER and they have a blood glucose of 800, if somebody freaks out, say, oh my gosh, they have this huge blood glucose, we got to give them insulin, and they shoot you with a bunch of insulin, and all of a sudden you make your blood glucose drop very quickly, because that's what insulin does. It gets rid of the blood gets rid of the glucose in the blood. When you drop very quickly, what happens is you don't give those idiogenic osmoles inside the brain. You don't give it time to readjust so it can start decreasing those. So now you give somebody, so they have a high blood glucose, say they have a glucose of 800, but they slowly got up there. So the brain, they're not seeing any problems with this yet because the brain has been making these idiogenic osmoles to balance it out. Now they come in, we shoot them with a bunch of insulin, and their blood glucose goes down to 800 and it drops down to 300 or 250. It'll drop real fast. This is too fast. This is faster than the brain can adjust. So what happens is now the brain has adjusted that oncotic pressure as the blood glucose drops. Now all the water switches from being in the bloodstream and it goes into the brain. So it's actually pulling water into the brain. And this is called cerebral edema. When the brain gets the water pulled into it, the brain swells. And this could be very, very bad. This could cause seizures, could cause death. It could cause all kinds of things. So the worst thing that you could do if you have somebody who has DKA is bring the glucose down too fast. Because the high glucose, you don't want to keep high glucose all the time, but you don't have to freak out if you see they're high. Because as soon as you see that they're high, obviously the body has adjusted for it. So all you got to do is start bringing it down very slowly. When I say slowly, you don't want to bring it down any faster than 90 milligrams per deciliter per hour. So, and really that's pretty fast. Most people try to be more safe with it because of the cerebral edema, trying to prevent the cerebral edema. So they may bring it down more slowly, like 50 to 70 milligrams per deciliter per hour. So again, if you have a blood glucose of 800, you want to just slowly bring that down by 50 an hour, all the way. So 800 down to 750, down to 700, and keep that going very, very slowly. And then there's other things we're going to do with the treatment, but that's the main thing, because you're also going to get fluid. You also have to worry about potassium, and there's other stuff, but the cerebral edema is the main thing that I want everybody to understand. So if you are type 1 diabetic, you do go into the hospital, you do start having a sweet smell on your breath. That means that you haven't been giving yourself enough insulin, if any at all. And so you're starting to build up all these ketone bodies in your blood. And again, don't get that confused with ketosis. This is ketoacidosis. This is a lot of ketones being blown up because there's no insulin present at all. So I want you to understand that if you have that, you do need to get to the hospital. They do need to admit you, and they need to bring that glucose down very, very, very slowly. So that's one thing you want to do is monitor seeing how fast that glucose is coming down. And that's why, because you don't want to bring it down so fast that these idiogenic osmoles in the brain don't have a chance to go back to the normal. And so it pulls the fluid in from the blood vessels because of where your blood glucose was really high, and now we bring it down too quickly. I know that's a lot of information. I hope I made it clear because this is a very serious thing. It's serious if you are a type 2 diabetic. This has to do with what you're eating. All you have to do is quit eating carbohydrates and you will totally reverse your type 2 diabetes. That's what type 2 diabetes is. Because you're eating glucose all the time, your carbohydrates turn into glucose, your glucose levels go high, your insulin levels go high, you eat all the way through the day, you get insulin resistance. So all you got to do is let your glucose levels come down by not eating it. And once those glucose levels come down, your insulin levels come down. So that's what you do. Type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes, please, please, please give yourself the insulin you want. But remember, if you decrease your carbohydrates or take them out totally, that's going to mean that you're going to give way, way, way less insulin. And that should be very, very, a lot less expensive for you in the long run. You can save a lot of money on insulin if you quit putting glucose in your blood. And the way you do that is quit eating carbohydrates, because that's where the glucose comes from. So I won't sit here and belabor this. I just want to make sure that you guys understood that DKA is a very serious condition. It can cause serious complications. But the biggest one you're going to see is bring your insulin levels or bring your glucose levels down too quickly once they're high. So that's all I have for you today. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Have a fantastic week. And as always, make simple, healthy choices to live a quality life.